Hi guys, in this video I'm going to be building the 1/72 Beaufighter TF.10 by Airfix. Before we start, as usual, let's take a look inside the box. The kit comes in the standard grey Airfix plastic. The panel lines are a little heavy, but they're not as heavy as I've seen on some other Airfix kits. Some areas of the kit, like the cockpit sidewalls, are softly moulded, so they'll need some careful painting to bring out the detail. The instructions are printed in red, black and white. They're fairly easy to follow, with the red areas showing areas that you've finished in the previous step. The kit comes with two paint marking schemes. The first one is an example from Operation Firedog in Kuala Lumpur 1949. The second is an aircraft based in Dalkey, Scotland in 1945. The build started with the wing spars on the cockpit. The glue I'm using is VMS Styrene Cement Fast, decanted into an old Tamiya bottle. The cockpit detail is a bit sparse considering the canopy is so open, so I'll be adding some more detail just to make it look a bit more interesting. I added some wiring to the underside of the side consoles with Plus Model's 0.2mm lead wire. This was glued in place with VMS Slow Setting CA. Lead wire is awesome for this, as it's so malleable, you can shape the wires exactly how you want them. I added some seat belts with 2mm masking tape. These were carefully pressed into place and then secured with VMS paper shaper. There was an important section of piping that Airfix missed with their moulding. I made this out of solder wire bent into shape and glued it in place with VMS CA. I fashioned some fittings for this by flattening some lead wire with the back end of a scalpel. This was cut into small sections, wrapped around the piping and then glued into place. The interior was primed with grey STYRENREZ and then painted with Mission Models black mixed with a small amount of poly and thinner. The interior was black based with HATAKA orange line interior grey green mixed 1:1 with MLT. To add some extra highlights to the interior, I used a mix of Vallejo white, black and olive green. This was painted with an Artist Opus 30 Kolinsky sable brush. Although it won't be seen, all of the interior ribbon was painted in the same manner. The large pipe was painted in a mix of Vallejo white and US field drab. The extra wires I added were painted with Vallejo black. When I'd finished the interior detail painting, I gave it a wash with burnt umber and French ultramarine artist oils. This was thinned with AK odourless thinners with a drop of VMS Oil Expert enhancing medium to help speed the drying. The instrument panel supplied by Airfix was a big disappointment, so I decided to replace it with a Yahoo one. These are my favourite drop-in replacement instrument panels. They just look great. The Yahoo IP was glued in place with VMS Slow Setting CA. Before I glued the fuselage halves together, I removed some of the excess paint with an INFINI sanding stick. I ran VMS fast setting styrene cement along the seams. The excess was squeezed out to make sure the bond was tight. The excess was sanded away from the seam lines. Firstly, with an 800 grit INFINI sanding stick. This was to get rid of the bulk of the excess plastic. I then used a spongy Flory model sanding stick to make sure the top was rounded. I'd lost some depth in the panel lines, so these were reinstated with a CMK razor saw. When the panel lines looked good to me, I used some VMS fast setting cement to get rid of any burrs and to soften the panel lines a bit. Putting the cockpit floor in was a bit of a brute force affair, but it got there in the end and nothing broke. The wing halves lined up fairly nicely and there was minimal cleanup. The construction of the main airframe went really well. The fit was good and I used minimal filler. The engines were painted with Mr. Colour GX2 gloss black, straight onto the bare plastic. This was thinned 1:1 with MLT. I had some K-Colour steel that I hadn't used yet, and I thought this was a great opportunity to try it. This metallic is alcohol based and it goes down really smoothly and looks really shiny, although it's more of a dark chrome than a steel. One of my biggest gripes with this kit were the engine nacelles. They just didn't fit very well. They were built by gluing 3 segments around the engine block. And I don't know, maybe the tolerances were too tight, but I had trouble getting them neat and tidy. There is one gap, and I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be there as it sits underneath the exhaust pipes. The seam lines were treated with AK grey putty. This was then sanded flush with some sanding sticks. The detail I'd lost was rescribed with my trusty CMK razor saw. The collector ink fit nicely with no extra fuss required. The exhaust pipe Airfix supplied was okay, but the detail was a bit soft, so I swapped it out for a QUICKBOOST one. For just a few pounds, I really think this lifted the detail of the kit. This was glued in place with VMS slow setting CA. The engine nacelles were pushed onto the model and left unglued to help painting later. I also added some QUICKBOOST air intakes. These are the wrong ones for this model, but they just look so much better than the kit ones. The fuel drains were also replaced with the QUICKBOOST resin ones. These also just look so much better than the kit parts. The oil cooler intakes were also replaced. This required some surgery. I decided to try to use masking fluid to mask my canopy glazing. This isn't something I've done before, so let's see how we get on. I applied this with a toothpick, carefully pushing it into the recesses around the panel framing. I used VMS TRANSPAFIX 6K to glue the canopy framing in place. This can get a little stringy, but it dries crystal clear. Before I moved on to the main paint job, I sprayed the canopy with HATAKA Orange Line Interior Green Grey to simulate the interior colour of the framework. The entire airframe was primed with grey STYRENEREZ, sprayed at 30 psi through my 0.2 Harder & Steenbeck. The next layer was a coat of Mission Models Black. This was mixed 10 drops paint to 2 drops poly to 3 drops thinner. The underside was painted with HATAKA Orange Line Sky Type S. This was mixed 1:1 with MLT. This was done in my usual black basing style. Picking out the panels in different intensities and making sure there's lots of tonal variation. This always looks a bit messy to start with, but it all comes together when you hit it with a blend layer of the base colour over the top. Whilst the process is really time consuming, the end results are worth it. The upper surfaces were painted in HATAKA Orange Line Extra Dark Sea Grey. Being a single colour camouflage scheme, I'm going to need to use lots of techniques to break up the surface and make it look interesting. This is only the first step. One thing I've noticed over time is that darker colours tend to black base a bit nicer. I think this is due to the size of the pigments. With lighter colours, no matter how much you thin the paint, they always tend to be a bit grainy. But this graininess is usually always fixed with the final blend layer. I mixed some Insignia white with the extra dark sea grey and used the finest Jussi van der Osten splatter stencil to add some texture. These splashes must be kept subtle, as if they're too obvious, they start to look unrealistic. The paint I used was thinned with about 90% MLT. I also added some highlights to the panels with the same mix. You can't see this very well on film, but it's noticeable in real life. After I'd done the highlights, I added some dark splatters with extra dark sea grey mixed with a touch of black. Always remember to keep this subtle. For any areas that look too extreme, you can lightly spray over the base coat to blend it in. I removed the masking tape for the demarcation line between the upper and lower colours. This needed some slight touching up. I used a fine sable brush and Misha Models RAF Underside Sky. The insert for the landing light didn't fit very well, and I kept looking at my fix, and it just didn't look great, so I decided to rescribe the panel lines. I used the CMK razor saw for this, and I was really careful not to damage the surrounding paintwork. This was blended back into the surface with a thin coat of the camouflage colour. Because the HATAKA lacquers sprayed so smoothly, I decided to decal straight over the paint job. The areas to be decaled were treated with Mr. Mark Setter to help the adhesion. The decals are printed by Cartograph in a really nice quality. The decals were set with Microsol. This was carefully brushed into place and left to dry. A clear coat isn't necessary for decals if your paint finish is nice and smooth. The more texture on your finish, the more chance of silvering you'll get. You can also get silvering if your decal adhesive fails. That's why I treat my decals with Mr. Mark Setter. This really helps the decals to stick to the surface. Microsol is used to get the decals to conform to the surface, so they sink into panel lines and details. When the decals are dried, I used VMS satin varnish to blend them into the surface. This is sprayed firstly around the decals to level off the surrounding finish. I then spray on a heavier layer, which should blend them in and make them look seamless. The VMS varnish self-levels really nicely, so it's indispensable for this process. The collector rings on Beaufighters are usually portrayed as being a copper sort of colour. The rings are actually steel that have gone through many colour changes due to the high temperatures, much like an exhaust pipe. These were painted with Mr. Colour GX2 and then given a layer of ALCLAD pale burnt metal. The tarnishing is usually strongest in the centre section of the ring. This was sprayed really carefully with ALCLAD burnt iron, thinned 1:1 with MLT. I don't usually thin my ALCLAD paints, but this needed an extra degree of control. The ALCLAD burnt iron was carried over to the exhaust pipes to give them an extra degree of weathering. I sprayed the tip of the cooling ring with ALCLAD aluminium. This was masked carefully with flexible masking tape. On the paint scheme I'm doing, the collector rings are supposed to be black, but I don't want to hide all this work, so I'm going to leave them bare metal. The upper surfaces were given a wash of burnt umber and French ultramarine artist oil thinned with AK odourless thinner. This was applied around the details and along the panel lines. Usually I'd meticulously clean up the excess wash. Instead, to add some more variation, I emulated a technique I'd seen online. The excess wash was blended in with a soft sponge to leave some dirty marks. If there is any excess, you can still remove it with a cotton bud, brush or paper towel. I added some more sponge stippling with a lighter version of the base coat. I mixed ultramarine blue, white and black for a lighter grey. I added more brown into my burnt umber and French ultramarine wash for the underside. This was washed and then stippled like before. I added some more shadows to the airframe with black, burnt umber and French ultramarine artist oils. This was blended in with a soft brush. I also highlighted some of the blue areas on the RAF roundels. I added some dirty areas around the most removed panels to simulate built-up grime and handprints. This was done with my dark oil paint mix. The whole airframe was then varnished with VMS Matte Varnish HD. This varnish is ultra matte and ultra smooth. I added some more grime splatters to the upper surface with Misha Models Black, Rail Tie Brown and Transparent Medium. This was heavily thinned. I also added some sooty streaks with the airbrush with the same mix. This was sprayed around 15 psi, building up the effect very carefully. I added some more shading and contrast to the underside with a mix of artist oils, burnt umber, alizarin green and white. I used my previous Misha Models mix for the exhaust stains. These again were built up very carefully. I used references to figure out the intensity and the shapes of the streaks. To add more interest to the exhaust streaks, I used the finest UC splatter and added some dirty marks around them. Next up, I added some streaking with some oils and some other weathering products. Firstly, I used AK Winter Streaking Grime. This was blended in with odourless thinners and a soft rake type brush. The brush is only slightly dampened with thinners. If you use too much thinner, you'll remove the paint. For some more oily stains, I used my favourite mix of burnt umber and French ultramarine. For some lighter marks, I used ABTEILUNG 502 dust. Now it's time to remove the masking fluid and expose the canopy glass. Well, this is going well. It looks like the lacquer had hardened too much and was flaking off all over the place. Marvellous. Nailed it! Okay, it's time to do some fixing. VMS to the rescue. I used VMS Clean Slate on a cotton bud and carefully wiped this over the offending paint. This was a bit of an on the bench hotfix. The Clean Slate is supposed to be for acrylic paint, but it's handling this lacquer with no problem. While I wish this hadn't happened in the first place, I was glad to have the Clean Slate to hand to fix the problem. I remasked the canopy framing with masking tape. This was then sprayed with a single layer of HATAKA Orange Line Extra Dark Sea Grey. The tape was then removed, revealing the much tidier canopy framing. Phew. As you can see, those seatbelts were a great addition because they're really visible in the cockpit. The rear MG was glued in with VMS slow setting CA. And then the rear canopy was carefully glued into place. I finally got hold of some black STYRENREZ, which makes sense as I do a lot of black basing. This was then used to prime the propellers. The tips of the propellers were painted with Misha Models white. This was followed with a layer of Misha Models RLM04 mixed with Farm Tractor yellow. After removing the tape, I chipped the propeller with a sponge and Citadel STORMHOST silver. Funnily, this is the only chipping I've done on this build. The propellers were finished with a layer of VMS matte varnish. You needed at least 3 hands to attach the propeller to the provided shaft. I used a toothpick to hold it in place, and then used VMS fast setting styrene cement. The engine nacelles were then glued onto the airframe. I attached the gear bay doors with slow setting VMS CA. These gear doors look very thick and I could have used resin replacements. The torpedo was base coated in GX2. It was then painted with ALCLAD steel. The torpedo was glued into place, but I decided it didn't look grimy enough. Torpedoes were quite oily, so I used AK grease for shafts and bearings and stippled this onto the steel finish. Once I was happy with that, I used some Ushi van der Rost and rigged that thing to rig the antenna, and the build was complete. So, it's been a while since I've built an Airfix kit, and the detail wasn't too bad. In some areas it was a bit soft, and some of the parts were overscale. The fit overall was pretty decent, and I can happily recommend this to a beginner. For me, this was supposed to be a mojo build, but ended up being a huge video. I was aiming for around 25 minutes, but there was so much texturizing and effects I wanted to show, I just couldn't choose what to cut. So, let me know how I did in the comments below. And don't forget to leave a like and hit that subscribe button. And of course, I'm not forgetting my patrons. You guys are awesome, thank you very much. I'll leave you with the photo reel now. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.